This is the holy gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Luke. Please stand as you are able. Jesus told the disciples a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, 'Grant me justice against my opponent.' For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, 'Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of God comes, will he find faith on earth?' This is the gospel of the Lord."
Thank you. In the name of the one holy and living God, amen. Please be seated. This time of year during the long green season, the season after Pentecost, we have two different tracks, two different options for the Old Testament reading and the psalm that goes with it. So it just so happens that I must have misunderstood when I was chatting with Mac this week, and also just fell in love with the reading from Genesis from the other track. So I'm going to read that to you now because that's what I've prepared to talk about, as wonderful as that reading from Jeremiah was. A reading from the book of Genesis. The same night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. The word of the Lord. Well, between the beautiful Psalm 121 that Holly read, where it says, "He will not let your foot be moved," And this Old Testament reading where Jacob winds up limping, you can see that I might have a little bit of sympathy with the readings for this week, over identifying with them a little bit, because of my accident 10 days ago. My foot did indeed slip, and I broke my ankle. But I think the consistent theme that I see through all of the readings this morning is that of faith and faithfulness. That kind of persistence that just doesn't give up. It's like pure grit. We see that in the widow in the gospel reading. I was talking about that reading with someone this week, and they said, gosh, how do you get that kind of faith? If I just had that kind of faith of the widow. And I thought back to the lesson we had a few weeks ago. You might remember that the disciples asked Jesus specifically, they said, increase our faith. And then he tells them some strange kind of thing that seems a little demoralizing and humiliating about servitude. You know, you're just a servant, go serve. But what I think he's saying is serving, walking the walk, faithfulness is how you increase your faith. You know, in the 12-step tradition, they say, fake it till you make it, right? And the widow has that kind of faithfulness. If she ever doubts in her heart that she is going to get the justice that she seeks, her foot never wavers, right? Her actions don't show it, because she continues to show up day after day after day. I think an important thing to know about this gospel reading, often the context is important, but I think with both the Old Testament and the gospel today, it's particularly important. And that's that what Jesus is saying just before he tells this parable about the widow and the unjust judge is that he's talking about the end times, right? He's talking about what in our children's program we call, and theology is referred to as parousia, right? When God will be all in all. The moment that we wait for, the moment that we declare our faith in the creeds, when all will be put to right. Right? When we'll finally see God face to face. So that's what he's talking about. And then he tells this parable about this widow who eventually gets her way. She eventually sees justice done. And he says, will not God answer swiftly his beloved who cry out to him day or night? Now, I don't know about you, but I have often thought that God has a very different idea of swiftly than I do. I don't know if that's been your experience, but so often it doesn't seem like, it seems like we offer prayers, we cry out day and night, and the thing that our heart desires, what can seem to us to be the only possible right and good outcome just doesn't happen. And it's helpful to me in those moments to think about the context and the vision of God being so much greater than my own vision and understanding. I listened this morning. It didn't wind up being too helpful for the sermon, but I listened to Garth Brooks' song that I remembered from my teenage years. Sometimes God's greatest gifts come in unanswered prayers, right? And sometimes those unanswered prayers are not gifts, right? Even that we can see, even in the context of a lifetime, right? But somehow standing in that juxtaposition, in that cognitive dissonance of our faith in a God who is life, who is love, who desires our well-being, and all of the difficulty and all of the evil and all of the struggle and all of the death in this world, standing in that breach is an act of faithfulness. In Timothy, the letter from Paul to Timothy, he says, be persistent whether the times are favorable or unfavorable. Right? And we have certainly seen some unfavorable times in these last few years, have we not? And yet we persist. That's faithfulness. The Psalm 121, reminds us of why we are able to be faithful. And that is because of God's faithfulness. The psalmist says, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where is my help to come? It's not in your insert because we have the psalm in the insert that goes with the other Old Testament reading, but you could look it up in the prayer book if you want. Psalm 121. It's one of my favorite psalms. We have the first line of it inscribed in the clear story window at Grace Church. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where is my help to come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And we are so fortunate, we're so blessed in this valley that we can actually literally lift up our eyes to the hills on either side of us. And we can see evidence of God's faithfulness. We can see our land regenerating itself, right, in the midst of the fires. Maybe not as quickly as we would want, but I tell you, if you drive through a petrified forest road where the Tubbs fire was 5 years ago now, was it? You see that regeneration big time, right? And so that gives me faith that it's going to happen here too, right? You see? We can look at nature. We can look at the world around us. We can look at our own history and past and ground ourselves in God's faithfulness. That can help us continue to be faithful ourselves. Now, this story that I read y'all from the Old Testament, from Genesis, one of the commentators I read this week said she thought this was the best example of faith, of the life of faith in the entire Bible. This image of Jacob wrestling with this man who's really God, right? This divine visitor, wrestling all night, struggling, but staying in the fight, even when his hip socket is put out of joint. If you've ever had anything like that happen to you, you know how painful that is. And he continues wrestling until almost dawn. And finally, that divine visitor says, all right, what do you want? Right? What is it that you want? And Jacob doesn't learn that visitor's name, right? But he himself gets a new name and a blessing because he's been faithful. He's continued in the struggle. He stayed engaged with God, right? He showed up. He didn't just give up and walk away and throw up his hands, even when it cost him. So Jacob calls this place Peniel. I have seen God face to face. And I wonder for you, what have been your Peniel moments in your life? When is it that you have wrestled with God? Right? Just really down and dirty wrestling, right? Really struggling, but staying in there. I know you've probably had them, and I have too. And maybe we all have in these last couple of years. I remember when I was 17 and my sister was 14, our dad was diagnosed with a pretty tough kind of cancer. And we were all sort of coming to terms with that right when he was diagnosed. And she was crying and I was crying and she was asking all these questions. And I said, Robin, you just have to go wrestle with your angel, right? Even if it takes all night, just wrestle. And I think so often that's what we are called to do in the life of faith. I know for me, this last year, between the physical impacts and the emotional impacts and the psychological impacts and the community impacts of the pandemic, it's like, I don't know if you have this, but when you get through an emergency, I'm kind of on the other side. Maybe this is like a mom thing. Then afterwards, you're like, okay, now I can fall apart. Like when you get the cold right when you go on vacation. And that kind of happened to me. Everything that we'd been through sort of came crashing down on me, and I wrestled. And God had me pinned, right? I couldn't move. I couldn't go any further. And what I discovered in that moment was, I don't really know anything about wrestling, but I think there's a thing where you sort of submit, you sort of like relax and let go, and then you can maybe sneak out of whatever's happening to you. Well, that was what happened to me. In my heart, when I said, okay, God, like you win. I don't know what this is about, but I'm still here with you. I'm still in this with you. You're going to have to help me find the way forward, is when I found the way forward. With a limp, as you can see, physical and in some other ways too. But with the knowledge that God never left me. that we were there together all along. So I really want to encourage you to think about this in this coming week. You know, you all have a feast day this week. I don't know if you knew that. It's St. Luke's Day, I think on Tuesday or Wednesday. Yeah, right? So, or throw a party if you want. But, you know, think about for yourselves, but also for this community of faith. What have been those Peniel moments? What's been the struggle? How have you continued to show up? Because I see that in you all, right? Through this pandemic, we showed up. We have, you know, people online. We have people in person, probably more people than before the pandemic involved in the life of this congregation, right? Y'all have shown up big time. At our diocesan convention this year, we're voting to approve the closing of 2 parishes in this diocese. And so many congregations are just trying to figure out how it is that they come through this difficult time with enough there, right? Enough faithful people showing up to continue to live out God's mission in the place where they're planted. And St. Luke's, you're doing that. Right? So there is cause for a party this week, right? Definitely. But there's also, I think, cause for reflection in this moment as we come through the pandemic to ask ourselves, what's the blessing that we've received in this struggle? What's the limp that we've come out with, right? Let's not pretend that it's back to normal, that we're not changed forever by what it is that we've been through. And what is our new name? Where is it that God's calling us now? I was on sabbatical this summer, and I had the great blessing to travel to the island of Iona, which is off the west coast of Scotland, between Scotland and Ireland. A tiny little island, just 1 mile wide and 3 miles long, that's an ancient holy place. I was in a rebuilt medieval monastery that was on the site of a 4th or 5th century monastery that was one of the first places of Christian worship in all of the British Isles, and has the longest history of sort of faithful presence there. But even before that, there was a sense that this was a holy place. And as I walked into the back doors of that sanctuary, I noticed something kind of odd. On my left, there was a little set of steps like that would go up to a balcony, but they only went about halfway up the wall, about maybe 10 or 15 feet, and I'm curious, so climbed up the steps, and I got to a little, Gothic arched wooden door that was pushed open, and it was so low that I had to duck to go through the door. And what I went into was a round chamber, maybe 5 feet in diameter, and tall enough that I could stand up with a vaulted ceiling. And there was a single, Gothic arched clear window in it that had ferns growing out of the cracks, because it's Scotland and everything's wet all the time. And one wooden chair in the middle. And it was clear to me that this was a place for solitary prayer. It was a place for wrestling. It was a place for resting. I don't know about you, but after I wrestle, sometimes I've got to rest. And we can do both in God, right? That's the beauty of it. Right? God invites that engagement, whether it's wrestling, yelling at God, or whether it's just allowing ourselves to float in God's grace and God's peace and God's presence. So I sat there a while, and I did a bit of both. And then as I walked out, I saw some words carved on the door of that little door that I had to stoop to get through. And the words were, "Stand fast. Stand fast. Be faithful. Be persistent, whether the times are favorable or unfavorable. Doesn't matter how you engage with God, just engage with God. Instead of walking away, instead of throwing up your hands, show up. Well, you're here, you've done it, right? Be there with God. And sooner or later, that blessing will come. That new name will come. And that new world, that world of justice and peace and love and plenty for all, that world will also come. I've said these things to you in the name of our friend and our Savior, Jesus the Christ. Amen.
Contributions to St. Luke's Episcopal Church help to make the digital ministry and other outreach within the community possible. If it is in your heart to make a donation, St. Luke's secure PayPal link, as well as the church's mailing information, may be found in the description of this video. Thank you.